If you want to see more detailed images, videos, and the full article, check the link in the description. Tensions in the Middle East have reached a fever pitch following a series of unprecedented events. The Trump administration, abandoning its previously isolationist foreign policy, launched a joint operation with Israel targeting 3 key Iranian nuclear sites. This bold move marks the most significant intervention in a regional conflict in generations and has ignited a volatile chain reaction. Almost immediately, Iran issued stark warnings of retaliation. President Masoud Pezeshkian, in a direct communication with French President Emmanuel Macron, declared that the U.S. must receive a response to their aggression, signaling the potential for a protracted and devastating conflict. Simultaneously, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced plans to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow, raising concerns about the potential for broader international involvement. Ali Akbar Velayati, an advisor to Iran's supreme leader, further escalated the situation, stating that any country aiding the U.S. in the strikes would be considered a legitimate target for Iranian armed forces. The U.S., however, showed no signs of backing down. Acting U.S. Ambassador Dorothy Scheer, addressing an emergency UN Security Council meeting called by Iran, asserted that any retaliatory Iranian action against American personnel or bases would be met with devastating retaliation. She justified the strikes as a defensive measure to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, citing Iran's alleged obfuscation of its nuclear program and its uncooperative stance in recent negotiations. Iran vehemently rejected the U.S. justification. Iranian UN Ambassador Amir Saeed Iravani condemned the strikes as a blatant violation of international law, suggesting that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had manipulated President Trump into carrying out the West's dirty work, thereby dragging the U.S. into another costly war. Russia's UN Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia echoed these concerns, warning that the U.S. had opened a Pandora's box with potentially catastrophic consequences. The aftermath of the strikes has been marked by a flurry of statements and actions from various actors. President Trump, upon the return of U.S. B-2 bombers to Missouri, initially hailed the operation as a complete success, claiming the targeted sites had been completely and totally obliterated. However, Vice President J.D. Vance later offered a more cautious assessment, suggesting the strikes may have only substantially delayed Iran's nuclear ambitions. Vance emphasized that the U.S. was not at war with Iran itself, but rather with its nuclear program, an apparent attempt to alleviate concerns within the Republican Party about the potential for another prolonged and costly conflict. Despite this, President Trump himself later hinted at the possibility of regime change in Iran, a prospect that immediately raised global alarm. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expressed satisfaction with the operation, stating that Israel was steadily progressing toward its objective of neutralizing Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities. He confidently asserted that Israel was very, very close to achieving its goals. President Trump, while initially emphasizing the limited nature of the intervention and urging Tehran to negotiate, left the possibility of a protracted war hanging in the balance, a stark contrast to his earlier promises to avoid such entanglements. World leaders responded with calls for restraint and a return to diplomatic negotiations. Western governments urged both sides to return to the negotiating table, while China and Russia strongly condemned the strikes, highlighting their destabilizing effect on global security. The details of the U.S. bombing operation itself are gradually emerging. The meticulously planned Operation Midnight Hammer involved 7 B-2 Spirit bombers, flying an 18-hour mission from the U.S. to deliver 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, bunker buster bombs, onto the targeted facilities in Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. General Dan Kane, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, while acknowledging significant damage, refrained from echoing President Trump's assertion of complete obliteration, leaving the precise extent of the damage uncertain. Iran, however, quickly denied the extent of the damage. Sources within Iran told Reuters that most of the highly enriched uranium at Fordow had been relocated prior to the attack, a claim that remains unverified. Satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies, however, revealed 6 fresh craters at the Fordow site, consistent with the impact of bunker buster bombs. Following the U.S. strikes, Iran responded with a barrage of approximately 20 ballistic missiles targeted at Israel, triggering nationwide air raid sirens and resulting in 16 injuries. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, issued a defiant statement, vowing that the Iranian nation would not surrender and warning the U.S. of irreparable damage should military involvement continue. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi declared that diplomacy was no longer an option and that Iran would exercise its right to self-defense. Further escalating the situation, Iran's parliament approved a measure authorizing the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a critical shipping lane for global oil trade, a move that would dramatically disrupt the global energy market. Experts like Andrew Bourine, former senior staff officer in counterterrorism at the U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence, warned that such a move, while potentially impactful, would ultimately harm Iran more than its adversaries, potentially alienating regional allies. The potential for further escalation remains high. The possibility of Iranian retaliation through its network of proxies across the Middle East, including groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis, looms large. The Houthis, for example, have explicitly threatened to attack U.S. ships in the Red Sea should the U.S. intervene further in Iran. Despite this, U.S. officials insist they are attempting to de-escalate the situation through diplomatic channels, urging Iran to negotiate rather than retaliate. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth categorically denied that the U.S. was pursuing regime change in Iran, emphasizing the limited scope of the operation. However, President Trump's own comments, coupled with the scale of the strikes and the subsequent Iranian response, cast a significant shadow on this assertion. In the aftermath of these events, the world watches with bated breath, uncertain of what the coming days may bring. The future trajectory of this conflict, whether it descends into a larger regional war or eventually finds a path towards de-escalation and renewed diplomacy, remains deeply uncertain and hangs precariously in the balance. The immediate future in the Middle East, it appears, will be shaped by a series of carefully calculated decisions and responses, each carrying the potential for catastrophic consequences. The sheer complexity of the situation, interwoven with geopolitical rivalries and a history of conflict, renders any prediction inherently uncertain. Only time will tell whether this crisis will trigger a larger conflagration or ultimately lead to a negotiated resolution. The international community's urgent calls for restraint and renewed diplomatic efforts underscore the gravity of the situation and the imperative to prevent a wider and potentially devastating conflict.